trumpet is sounding the call for the war. McClellan's our leader, he's gallant and strong. We'll gird on our armor and be marching along. Marching along, we are marching along.
By 1862, it had become clear that the Civil War was going to last far longer than many had expected. Union armies had yet to score any significant victories over the Confederate forces, and people in the North were starting to question whether the fight for the Union was worth the cost. Early in the war, Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposed a two-pronged strategy to defeat the South: a blockade of the ports in the seceding states and control of the Mississippi River, which would cut the Confederacy in two. That became known as the Anaconda Plan. The blockade and control of southern ports would prevent the Confederacy from trading with European countries for needed equipment and supplies. North Carolina's coast was key to controlling the state, and the taking of Hatteras Island in 1861 had given Union forces a base of operations. But General Scott considered that foothold little more than a refueling station for the blockading fleet and not a piece of broader strategy to control the state. When George McClellan took over as General-in-Chief in November 1861, after Scott resigned, he had a greater interest in coastal operations as part of a larger effort to disrupt Confederate communications and supply lines and draw forces from the primary target of Richmond. In January, in an effort to shift the tide of the war, President Lincoln ordered Union forces to move on all fronts. McClellan and his federal commanders planned to establish a stronger presence in North Carolina by taking Roanoke Island and other coastal targets. They would then push into the interior of the state from that base of operations. A fleet of more than 60 ships under the command of L.M. Goldsboro and a landing force of nearly 15,000 men under General Ambrose Burnside left Annapolis, Maryland on January 9th. The joint naval and army operation would be known as the Burnside Expedition. After being battered and delayed by stormy weather, the Federal fleet approached Roanoke Island on the morning of February 7th. Roanoke Island lay between North Carolina's coast and the state's outer banks. Although it was less than 10 miles long and only 2 miles wide, its location was strategically important. Confederate defenses included 3 forts on the western side of the island: Bartow, Blanchard, and Huger, and about 3,000 men from North Carolina and Virginia regiments. The troops had been bolstered by the recent arrival of reinforcements. The Southern naval forces protecting the island consisted of 8 converted workboats that were disparagingly called the Mosquito Fleet. The Confederate forces were commanded by Brigadier General Henry Wise. However, he had fallen ill. Henry Shaw, a former U.S. representative and colonel of the 8th North Carolina, led the defenders when the Burnside expedition arrived.
This place, this island, is the cork in the bottle, so to speak. As you can see over my shoulder, the body of water is the Albemarle Sound. This leads into Plymouth and all the interior waterways from here. To the south of the island is Pamlico Sound and the Neuse River Basin, which will give you New Bern. It was Burnside's idea to bring ships up here and move the troops by amphibious assault. In the first true U.S. amphibious assault under fire, the troops will land here on February 7th, 1862, under a blistering fire of about 30 Union gunboats, Army and Navy combined, which will fire on the 3 Confederate forts here on the island and 1 on the mainland.
The Federal naval forces bombarded and set fire to Fort Bartow and pushed aside the Mosquito Fleet, which withdrew to Elizabeth City. Union infantry began landing during the afternoon of February 7th in Ashby's Harbor on the western side of Roanoke Island.
On February 8th, the Union Army, now 11,500 strong against a roughly 25 to 3,000 man Confederate force in the area, decides to advance up the main road.
The Union ground forces were organized into 3 brigades. The units were led by Brigadier Generals John Foster, Jesse Reno, and John Parke, with regiments from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island.
The 25th Massachusetts in advance, skirmishing with Confederates under Henry Wise of the 46th Virginia and some North Carolinians. They drive them back across the field, and as soon as the 25th Massachusetts enters the field, they start beginning to engage the entire Confederate line, the earthworks included. They expend all their ammunition, all 40 rounds, and then soon find that they have to withdraw. As they're withdrawing, the next regiment in line, the 10th Connecticut, shows up, and in the exchange actually fires on the 25th Massachusetts accidentally. It's a series of fights that's going to happen throughout the day. As new regiments move in, seeing shadows in the smoke, they open fire, not realizing who's blue and who's gray. The 10th Connecticut will hunker down in the swampy grass for a while the remainder of Foster's brigade will start going to the right and try to go through the swampy area on the eastern side of the island. They bog down almost immediately, fighting tussock to tussock. One Union veteran who was there said, if you were at Roanoke Island and didn't get wet, you weren't at Roanoke Island.
After about 4 hours of intense fighting through haze and swampy ground, Union troops were finally able to take a 3-gun battery at the center of the Confederate line and push the defenders back into their camps, where they were forced to surrender. The Federal forces had captured Roanoke Island, about 2,500 Confederate soldiers and 32 artillery pieces, with just a few dozen casualties. Roanoke Island would become the site of a freedmen's colony for liberated and runaway slaves from around the region. By the end of the war, about 3,500 refugees would call the island home.
2 days after the battle here on Roanoke Island, the Union Navy went hunting. And they found the Confederate Navy, the Mosquito Fleet, up in Elizabeth City. The Union Navy, limiting in its actual artillery, was told by Commodore Rowan not to waste any ammunition at long range, but to close in and almost grapple with their components.
The superior Federal naval forces made short work of the Mosquito Fleet, scattering and sinking it. The Confederate fleet's flagship, the Seabird, was run down by a Union warship and sunk in a collision. After securing Elizabeth City on February 10th, Federal troops captured Edenton 2 days later.
With that, no Confederate forces in northeastern North Carolina were available for any defenses whatsoever for another few weeks.
After taking control of Roanoke Island and the surrounding area, Burnside turned his attention toward another of his primary objectives, New Bern, a vital seaport for the Confederacy, transportation center, and North Carolina's former capital and second largest city. Burnside's force set sail on March 11th, stopping at Hatteras to pick up more men. New Bern's residents had anticipated that Federal forces would attempt to capture their town, and many had already evacuated. The city was defended by about 4,000 Confederates under the command of Brigadier General Lawrence O'Brien Branch. Branch had built entrenchments and 7 forts to defend New Bern. The largest was Fort Thompson. The fort had 13 guns, 10 of which guarded the river, and the other 3 covered the land approaches. The Neuse River passage was defended from attacking ships by torpedoes and other obstructions, including sunken hulls.
Burnside arrived off the mouth of the Neuse River on the night of March the 12th and disembarked the next morning on the 13th. He disembarked, unloaded all of his men on the 13th, and began marching up towards New Bern. He encountered the First obstacle, which was the Croatan Works, but there was nobody there. This was supposed to be the first line of defense for New Bern, but the men had already retreated towards New Bern, and so there was nobody at the Croatan Works. They left the Croatan Works and began marching up towards New Bern, but it was raining heavily, and so they marched up in heavy rain and mud.
While the Union infantry advanced, the Federal gunboats carefully moved up the river toward the town, shelling the woods to scatter the defenders. About a half-mile below the main Confederate defensive line, the fleet engaged in a duel by artillery with Fort Dixie. That lasted until nightfall.
Burnside had about 13,000 men bivouacked in about a mile below the Confederate forces. They bivouacked that night, sleeping in the rain. Meanwhile, the Confederate forces had only 4,000 men. They slept in the rain as well. They could not have any fires, because any fires that they would have would draw artillery from the ships, the Union ships out there at in the river. So they didn't get any sleep at all, whereas the Federals did get some sleep, and they had a very rough night.
On the morning of March 14th, Burnside ordered an advance on the mile-long defensive line, which ran between Fort Thompson on the river and the Atlantic and North Carolina Railroad line. Brigadier General John Foster's brigade was on the Federal right, nearest the fort. Major General Jesse Reno advanced his men down the railroad on the Federal left flank, and Major General John Parke's brigade followed in support.
So between General Reno and General Foster is where the heavy part of the fighting took place. Then on the other side of the railroad, there was a hillside full of trees, deciduous trees, and this is where the 26th North Carolina was stationed.
The battle began with Foster's brigade attacking Fort Thompson, which also was being shelled by the Federal gunboats. The fortification's 3 land-facing guns, Confederate infantry fire, and imprecise shelling from the gunboats temporarily stalled the Union infantry's advance. However, Foster's men eventually stormed and took the fort, while another part of the brigade engaged poorly trained Confederate militia.
Many of them had squirrel guns. Many of them did not even have uniforms and had not seen any battle at all, had little training, and they fired 1 shot or maybe 2 shots and panicked.
Meanwhile, Reno advanced his men up the railroad line, putting more pressure on the defenders. With his center collapsing, Confederate General Branch ordered a withdrawal. That order didn't reach Colonel Zebulon Vance and his 26th North Carolina, who continued to engage Reno. Eventually, Vance was forced to retreat toward New Bern as Federal forces breached the defenses.
When they get to the bridge at New Bern, they find out that the bridge at New Bern is on fire, and there's no way for them to escape to New Bern. So at that point, they turn around and head to Claremont Bridge to go across the river. When they get to Claremont Bridge, they find out that that bridge too is burning. So they can't go across the bridge at Claremont. So Vance decides to get on his horse and swim across the bridge, across the river, but his horse can't do it. The horse throws him into the water, and Vance swims across the river, goes across the river, and goes about a half a mile down the road and finds a boat. Takes the boat and goes across the river and begins ferrying his forces across the river back and forth until he gets his forces on the other side of the river. At that point, they march down to Trenton, North Carolina, and from Trenton they go to Kinston.
As the Federals approached, the citizens of New Bern set fire to certain buildings and supplies in an effort to keep them out of Union hands. But the burning of cotton and turpentine was fueled by winds and set even more of the town ablaze. Official reports following the battle put the Union losses at 471 men, while Confederates counted 578 casualties. Confederates would try to retake New Bern a number of times over the next 3 years, but those attempts would fail. The key seaport would remain in federal control for the remainder of the Civil War. Fort Macon was one of a chain of defensive forts that the United States built after the War of 1812 against the threat of foreign attack. The fort was constructed from 1826 to 1834 to defend Beaufort Harbor, the second largest seaport in North Carolina. When the Civil War began, Fort Macon was taken over by local Confederate militia, which armed it and prepared it for battle. After taking New Bern, Burnside targeted Fort Macon as part of the Union's effort to take the important logistical port of Beaufort.
1862, March, Union forces were able to capture the city of New Bern, and they came down the railroad from New Bern to occupy Beaufort and Morehead City, which is across the harbor from Fort Macon. Those points were taken without any resistance. All the garrison of Fort Macon and the surrounding area had been pulled back into the fort itself. So the Union Army was able to occupy Beaufort, Morehead City, Carolina City, and pretty much cut the fort off from outside help. Union Navy forces, there were 4 gunboats blockading the harbor entrance offshore off Beaufort Inlet, and so Fort Macon was pretty much surrounded.
Colonel Moses J. White and his garrison of 403 Confederates defended the encircled fort. Despite their predicament, the besieged defenders refused 3 demands for surrender.
When the last demand to surrender was offered, there was no choice except for the Union soldiers to open fire with their artillery and bombard the fort. The Union forces had 3 batteries of artillery entrenched in the sand dunes. There were 2 batteries of mortars, 8 and 10-inch caliber, and then a battery of rifled cannons, 30-pounder parrot rifles. After the last demand to surrender, then the following morning, April 25th, 1862, the Union Army opened fire on Fort Macon with their artillery and proceeded to blast the fort for 11 hours with their cannons. Helping them from the ocean would be a flotilla of 4 Union Navy gunboats. The gunboats had been offshore blockading the harbor entrance, so when the bombardment began, they steamed up and joined in as well. Now, the fort was built for defense against a naval attack, so the gunboat attack was not something that was really a problem. The guns of the fort turned to face the Union gunboats and opened fire. 2 of the Union gunboats were hit by the fort's cannon fire. The flotilla commander's ship had a 65-pound, 8-inch cannonball from the fort go through the side of the ship through 2 decks into the engine room, missed the engine and main steam line by only 6 inches, and almost went completely out the bottom of the ship. Now, right after that happened, the flotilla commander decided that's about enough of this, turned his ships around, left the battle, steamed away, did not come back. So the fort very easily drove the ships of the Union Navy away like it was supposed to do. It was built for defense against naval attack. Against the cannons of the Union Army in the sand dunes outside the fort, about 3/4 of a mile away, that was another matter entirely. The fort was not prepared to defend against siege positions and artillery being fired from the western side.
There were 54 cannon in the fort at the time, but none of them was a mortar that could launch projectiles at steep angles and drop exploding shells on an entrenched enemy. Lacking mortars, the Confederates were unable to provide effective counter-battery fire against the Union guns and resorted to aiming the cannons they had at rakish angles. Meanwhile, the Federal forces brought to bear 2 batteries of mortars as well as powerful rifled cannon against the mismatched defenders.
No one was really aware of what rifled artillery could do to a structure like this with 5-foot thick brick walls. Well, when the battle took place, they got their answer very quickly. These rifled cannons had enough power to crack the walls open and even breach them. And that's exactly what happened here. The fort was hit almost 600 times during the course of the battle. It was very badly damaged. Walls were cracking in different places. And the most important room in all of Fort Macon was cracking open from this cannon fire, from the rifled artillery. That's one of the gunpowder magazines. Fort Macon has 3 powder magazines. One of the gunpowder magazines, the main one in fact, was cracking open from artillery fire. It was on the side nearest the Union guns, so that was what the Union forces concentrated on. And they were cracking the walls open. That one magazine contained 10,000 pounds of gunpowder. So if one artillery shell had been able to breach the wall into that room, well, we know what the result would be. So the Confederates in Fort Macon are faced with a rather dismal prospect. They're about to get blown up by their own gunpowder. As the wall is cracking, this danger looms very large in their minds. And after a while, the magazine was cracking to the extent that they realized, that's it, we are done. So at 4:30 on the afternoon of the battle, the white flag was displayed. Fort Macon surrendered.
The following morning, Federal forces took control of the fort and paroled the Confederate prisoners. The Union Army would occupy the fort for the rest of the war. Casualties were light, given the intense bombardment, with Confederates having 7 men killed and 18 wounded. Union forces suffered even fewer losses, with 1 man killed and 3 wounded. The battle at Fort Macon was the second time in history where rifled guns were used against a fort. It also signaled the obsolescence of those structures as a means of defense. In mid-April, while Fort Macon was still under siege, Burnside moved to prevent what he saw as an emerging threat to Union control of North Carolina's coast. The clash between the Confederate ironclad Virginia and the Union's Monitor and March had demonstrated the power of such warships and made it clear that wooden ships were obsolete. When Burnside learned that Confederates were building ironclads in Norfolk, he moved to destroy the locks at the Dismal Swamp Canal to prevent warship access to Albemarle Sound.
So he orders Jesse L. Reno to take 2 regiments from the New Bern garrison, the 51st Pennsylvania and the 21st Massachusetts, and Rush Hawkins's 4th Brigade, the 6th New Hampshire, 9th New York, and 89th New York, to advance from Roanoke Island to take the locks, or at least blow up the locks of the canal.
About 3,000 Federals under Reno disembarked from their transports near Elizabeth City on April 18th. Early the next morning, they began to advance. After a tough march that found part of the force under Rush Hawkins mistakenly taking the wrong road, the Northerners encountered some 900 Confederates, led by Colonel Ambrose R. Wright, at the crossroads about 3 miles below South Mills.
They get to what is now South Mills, North Carolina, and they see Confederates arrayed across their front. A bunch of militia from several North Carolina regiments, an artillery battery under McComas, and the 3rd Georgia, considered as close to a regular regiment as the Confederates have in this area from Norfolk. They're arrayed in an entrenched position across an open field and have already set fire to one of the trenches in front of them to slow up any potential Union assaults. Like Roanoke Island, immediately Reno starts to look for a flank by going to the right, through some woods. But again, swampy ground slows him up. And as they're pushing their way through, Hawkins decides that he'll attract attention, maybe even force the position by a direct assault. He brings the 9th New York, the Hawkins Wasps, in their red fezzes and blue uniforms, backed up by the 89th New York to a charge. They cross the roasted ditch, assault the Confederates, but are swept away by the combined fire of artillery and infantry. The 9th New York and 89th New York swing to the right, while the 21st Massachusetts attempts to flank again. They still bog down, and the battle ends with the unlikely unit, the 6th New Hampshire, going to the left.
After several hours of fighting and an effective flanking volley by the 6th New Hampshire, the Confederates pulled back behind Joy's Creek. Hearing a rumor that Confederate reinforcements were arriving from Norfolk, Reno abandoned the operation without destroying the locks. Union casualties were estimated at 114 men, and Confederates lost about 25, including their artillery commander, Captain W. W. McComas. The fight at South Mills was the first setback for Union forces during Burnside's campaign. With Union forces having a solid foothold in eastern North Carolina, President Lincoln sought to appoint a military governor to reestablish the federal government's authority and help bring the state back into the Union's fold. Lincoln selected Edward Stanley, a New Bern native who had served in the U.S. House of Representatives and who had run unsuccessfully for governor of California in 1857. Stanley considered himself an old-line North Carolina Whig and believed that the state's secession was merely a misunderstanding. After arriving in New Bern on May 26th, Stanley quickly found his mission untenable. Disagreeing with federal authorities, opposing emancipation, and resisting a school for black children put him at odds with many Unionists. Secessionists were not willing to give up their fight for independence and deemed Stanley a traitor. Stanley believed that the President's Emancipation Proclamation would make reconciliation impossible, and he resigned in January 1863 after it was finalized. Lincoln would not appoint another wartime governor in North Carolina for the duration of the war. Meanwhile, because of his successful coastal operations, Burnside had been promoted to Major General of Volunteers on March 18, 1862. That June, Burnside was recalled to Virginia along with 7,000 men, leaving General John Foster in command of the Union Department of North Carolina with too few men to launch offensive operations for several months. Burnside fought at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 and was later made commander of the Army of the Potomac. But his defeat at Fredericksburg and another failed attempt to take Richmond would lead to his replacement and reassignment. After the fall of Fort Macon and the battle at South Mills, Confederate and Union forces fought only a few small skirmishes until June 5th. On that date, a fight broke out at Tranter's Creek near Washington, North Carolina. Colonel Edward E. Potter was in command of the Union forces occupying Washington when he learned of Confederate plans to attack the town. Potter called for reinforcements from New Bern.
He knew there were Confederate forces nearby, but he did not know in what strength or exactly where they were. On June 5, 1862, he orders a reconnaissance and sends a regiment, the 24th Massachusetts, out to go find Confederate forces that he knows are somewhere west of the town along Tranter's Creek. Colonel Francis Osborne, commander of the 24th Massachusetts, has about 500 men under his command, as well as a detachment of cavalry and artillery support.
The Federals marched out to meet the Confederate threat, advancing on roads rendered muddy by a heavy rain that had fallen.
On the west bank of Tranter's Creek is the 44th North Carolina, commanded by Colonel George Singletary. The 44th is a relatively new regiment. They've existed only for a few months. Tranter's Creek will wind up being their first engagement.
The defenders were about equal in number to the Union forces moving to confront them, some 500 men. The 44th had built breastworks across a bridge and near a sawmill and cotton gin.
Along with Osborne's infantry is a detachment from the 1st New York Marine Artillery. This unit, even though it's an Army unit, you could mistake them for sailors. They're dressed in Navy uniforms and they have Navy boat howitzers. The unit was actually recruited to serve on what we would refer to today as brown water gunboats operating along the waterways of eastern North Carolina. One of those gunboats took position in the river.
The gunboat Pickett shelled the Confederate defenders to support the Union attack, which was slowed by swampy ground. Within minutes, the Federals lost more than a dozen men, but the tide of the battle turned when Colonel Singletary was killed by a Union sniper. Singletary's brother, Thomas, took command of the 44th North Carolina, but the Confederates were forced to withdraw about 3 hours into the combat after 4 men had been killed. Having driven away the enemy, the Federal forces rejoined the garrison at Washington. Although it was a relatively minor clash, Union Lieutenant William B. Avery of the 1st New York Marine Artillery would be awarded the Medal of Honor for handling his battery, quote, with the greatest coolness amidst the hottest fire, unquote. North Carolinians went to the polls to elect a new governor in August. The election wasn't supposed to take place until 1863, but John W. Ellis, who held the office when the state seceded, died in July 1861. Henry Toole Clark, the Speaker of the State Senate, served as North Carolina's chief executive until the election could be held. In the 1862 election, Zebulon Vance, a colonel with the 26th North Carolina Regiment and candidate for the Conservative Party, soundly defeated Democrat William Johnston, a railroad executive from Mecklenburg County, who was serving as the state commissary general. During the campaign, conservatives, including influential newspaper editor William Woods Holden, had blamed the current Democratic leaders and the Confederate government for the coastal occupation by Union forces and for other wartime hardships. When North Carolina seceded in May 1861, Vance was a captain in the Rough and Ready Guards, a company of the 14th North Carolina Regiment. Later that year, he was elected to command the 26th North Carolina and led that unit in the Battle of New Bern in March 1862. As wartime governor, Vance gained popular support by working to provide North Carolina citizens and troops with clothing, food, and supplies. But he often clashed with Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government over conscription efforts and other dicta coming from Richmond. Vance served as North Carolina's chief executive for the remainder of the war and won election as governor again in 1876 when he ran as a Democrat. After Burnside was recalled to Virginia, General John G. Foster was left in command of the Union Department of North Carolina with only a single brigade. Foster lacked the men to continue offensive operations until late October of 1862, when several thousand Union volunteers arrived in New Bern. Foster aimed to continue what Burnside had begun by taking the strategic town of Goldsboro and cutting the vital Wilmington and Weldon Railroad line, which could be used to send men and materiel wherever they were needed. After that objective was achieved, Foster planned on taking Wilmington, the last Confederate port in North Carolina.
All they need is the opportunity, and this opportunity arises in December 1862. Foster now has enough troops, and he has this campaign going on elsewhere that he can attach himself to. This is the Fredericksburg campaign. General Ambrose Burnside is now the commander of the principal Union Army in the field in Virginia, the Army of the Potomac, and he's planning to attack Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which is entrenched outside Fredericksburg, Virginia. This is the opportunity that Foster is going to take. So in the morning of December 11th, 1862, just as Burnside's men are crossing the waters of the Rappahannock in preparation for attacking Lee's army, Foster marches forth from New Bern, bound for Goldsboro. He has with him an army of about 12,000 men. This is 10,000 infantry, 4 brigades cut up into 21 infantry regiments, 640 cavalry, the 3rd New York Cavalry, and 40 artillery pieces, everything ranging from 12-pound mountain howitzers up to 20-pound Parrott rifles, 32-pound howitzers. These are very large guns to be dragging along the little sandy and muddy roads of eastern North Carolina. He also has with him a wagon train of about 150 wagons full of supplies and ammunition, a pioneer corps of ex-slaves, about 300 strong. These men are armed with picks and shovels and tools. They're going to rebuild bridges and roads that have been destroyed by the Confederates as they move along.
Foster left New Bern with his 12,000 men on December 11th, taking a circuitous route toward Goldsboro in an attempt to confuse the enemy about his objective. After a few small skirmishes along the way, the Federal forces met Confederate defenders just outside of Kinston.
When they reach this area, they're greeted by a small Confederate army of maybe 2,000 men, commanded by General Nathan Evans of South Carolina. Evans has a 175-foot earthwork on the north bank of the river, just to the east side of the bridge.
which is going to be manned initially by Mallett's North Carolina Battalion with Boyce's South Carolina Battery. But his main line is going to be on the south bank, and it runs in sort of a semicircular fashion, a rough semicircle, with its flanks resting on or near the riverbank. On both sides of the Wilmington Road, there are swamps, the swamp on the east side being a little bit deeper and more difficult than the one on the west side of the road. General Evans is going to place his troops in position to be able to defend this, what Foster later called a natural breastwork. He has with him the 61st North Carolina, several companies of which are posted here at a little church called Harriet's Chapel. Other elements of the 61st are posted on the extreme right of the Confederate line near the riverbank. They are joined there by Mallett's Battalion after it crosses the river to the south bank, the Holcomb Legion of South Carolina troops. Then on the other side of the Confederate line on their right, they have the 17th, 22nd, and 23rd South Carolina Infantry Regiments. Again, it is a force of about 2,000 men. He does have 3 batteries of artillery. Starr's Battery, which is posted here at Harriet's Chapel, which has 6 smoothbore cannon, Boyce's South Carolina Battery, and Bunting's North Carolina Battery. These are the troops that are going to confront General Foster's troops as they make their way up from the Woodington area of Lenore County up towards the Neuse River Bridge.
The Federals advanced on the Confederates, which were posted on the south bank of the Neuse River with the bridge at their backs. The Union forces struggled to move forward as the woods hampered artillery support, and infantry moving up on the east side of the road got bogged down in the swamps.
Over on Foster's extreme right, he sent most of his troops through this very, very deep and thought to be impenetrable swamp. These men are led by the 9th New Jersey, 17th Massachusetts. Behind them, the brigades of Wessels and Stevenson. They plunge into the swamp. They have very, very difficult going. Some of the lead troops are slogging their way, being shot at. They can't see who's firing at them. They really can't return fire terribly well. They're tripping, they're falling down in the water. It is very, very tough going. The 10th Connecticut finally makes their way through the swamp along with the 44th and 45th Massachusetts, the 17th Massachusetts, the 9th New Jersey, 103rd Pennsylvania, 96th New York. All these troops, after about 2 to 3 hours of heavy fighting in the swamp, finally emerge on the high ground on the north side of the swamp. They're relieved having gotten out of the swamp, but now their troubles really are even worse. They're now exposed to all of these 3 South Carolina regiments who are firing fast and furious at them, and they begin taking heavy casualties. Connecticut, which went into this action with 366 men, lost 100 men in about 20 to 30 minutes. So they're taking very, very heavy fire, and it looks pretty grim for the Union advance at this point. But now things transpire which are going to completely change the character of this battle.
After 3 hours of fighting, Confederate troops began to run low on ammunition, and Union forces on the right pressed forward. Evans ordered his troops to withdraw into Kinston and set fire to Jones Bridge. Not all of the defenders received the word to fall back, and some kept fighting. They soon were forced to retreat as well, and in the chaos, about 400 Confederates were captured at the burning bridge. Evans regrouped in Kinston, while the Union Army marched toward Whitehall and then Goldsboro. Foster had lost about 160 killed and wounded in the fight. Confederate casualties were 125 killed and wounded, along with the 400 captured, and Kinston was thoroughly looted by the Federal troops. After pushing back the Confederate defenders at Kinston, Foster's Union forces moved on Whitehall, now known as Seven Springs. On the evening of December 15th, the Federals reached Whitehall, where they planned to take the bridge and destroy the Confederate ironclad CSS Neuse, which was currently under construction.
General Foster's army, once it left Kinston, had a pretty easy march that day. It was over fairly level ground. It was less swampy than it had been before, and the men were able to supplement their meager rations by foraging the countryside for sweet potatoes and chickens and hogs and things of that nature. Late in the afternoon of the 15th, Foster's army reaches a point about 3 or 4 miles to the east of Whitehall where they go into camp. But Foster is not finished for the day. He knows that a gunboat is being built at Whitehall, will become the CSS Neuse. He also wants to burn the bridge across the Neuse River to bottle up Confederate troops on the north bank of the river so that they can't recross and harry the rear of his column as he marches along towards Goldsboro. So Foster details 3 companies of 3rd New York Cavalry, along with 2 artillery pieces, a section of artillery, to move forward out in front of his camp 3 or 4 miles to the little village of Whitehall. These men ride in just before dark, and the bridge erupts into flames. Confederate General Beverly Robertson has set fire to the bridge, has men set fire to the bridge. He's in command of Confederate troops at Whitehall. These are the 11th North Carolina, portions of the 59th and 63rd North Carolina. He will be supplemented in the night by reinforcements of 31st North Carolina, but right now these are the only troops at his disposal. They are all on the north bank of the river. These guns are unlimbered. The men get off their horses, they tire their horses up, begin trading fire across the river with Confederates they can't even see. They're also having trouble just seeing the CSS Noose. The bridge has been burned, that was part of their mission. They didn't even have to do that. The Confederates saved them the trouble, but they want to destroy the CSS Noose. They're having a hard time because they can't see it terribly well. It's very dark now. To remedy this, they go in sheds that are scattered around the town. Remember, Whitehall at that point is a river port. There are hundreds of barrels of turpentine. They roll them down on the bank of the river, set them on fire, and the flames bounce off the low-hanging clouds, illuminating the gunboat on the north bank of the river.
The Union artillery began blasting away at the noose, but the gunboat proved difficult to damage, as it was merely the framework of a vessel.
Seeing this, a young volunteer steps forward, Private Henry Butler of the 3rd New York Cavalry. He strips off his clothes, jumps into the Neuse River. This is at night, it's December, it's cold, a very brave thing to do any time of year. But he swims to the north bank, he grabs a piece of the still burning bridge, rushes over to the CSS Noose, and tries to set fire to the CSS Noose. He's discovered very quickly by a party of Confederates who trained their fire upon him. He does a smart thing now, he throws down his torch, he jumps back in the Neuse River, swims back to the south bank of the river, and other than getting a belly full of Neuse River water, he's unscathed by the experience.
Early on the 16th, Foster sent the 9th New Jersey into the town of Whitehall. There they engaged the defenders. The 9th later was joined by other regiments in a move aimed at confusing the Confederates about the Union objectives. But most of the Federal Expeditionary Force was kept on the march toward the primary target, Goldsboro.
After the infantry had been firing here for about the better part of 2 hours, they were taking a fair number of casualties, and they began moving up towards, upon orders from Foster, moving towards the riverbank to make it more believable, the feint more believable that they were going to actually try to force a crossing of the river, again to confuse the Confederates as to what their ultimate destination might be. These troops made it so far to the riverbank that some of them actually went the extra mile. They strapped axes to their backs. Some Connecticut troops jumped in the river, swam with axes to the north bank, and cut down large trees that they felled into the river towards the center. Troops on the south bank did the same thing, and they had a rudimentary bridge in a fairly short amount of time. They also tore down a couple of sheds and used the lumber from those sheds to try to make this bridge a little bit more believable. The troops actually thought they were going to cross. It was simply a feint, however. Very late in the afternoon, Foster finally has decided he's done all the damage here he's going to do. He's not going to be able to really destroy the CSS Noose, and the bulk of his column is well on its way towards Goldsboro. So he has his men leave the village of Whitehall, march out of here and towards their ultimate destination, which is going to be the vicinity of the railroad bridge across the Neuse River 3 miles south of Goldsboro.
As they marched towards Goldsboro, the Federals left behind a heavily damaged town as Whitehall was hit by artillery fire from both sides. Confederate losses were fairly light as they fought from defensive positions, with about 11 killed and 50 wounded. Union casualties were some 30 killed and 140 wounded.
Once Foster's army left Whitehall, it marched during the day of the 16th and camped about 8 miles from the bridge on the night of the 16th. His men were up early on the morning of the 17th and began heading towards their destination just 7 or 8 miles away. Mid-morning, somewhere between 10 and 11 o'clock, the lead units finally reached the vicinity of their prime objective, the wooden railroad bridge which spans the Neuse River 3 miles south of Goldsboro. These troops arrive there. They are confronted by a small Confederate army of around 2,000 men. At this point, there's the 8th, 51st, and 52nd North Carolina, along with about 12 guns, including Starr's Battery, Badham's Battery, and Bunting's Battery. There's also a monitor car that's parked on the north entrance to the bridge that's ready to throw shot and shell through the bridge to anyone attacking on the direct line atop the railroad embankment. These troops are all commanded by General Thomas Clingman. He's going to be reinforced as the day goes on by additional North Carolina troops, and ultimately South Carolina and Mississippi troops will arrive, but they will arrive too late to take part in much of the fighting this day. Most of the fighting is going to be done by these North Carolina regiments.
Sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock, Foster sent his troops forward from the southeast of the railroad bridge. Spearheading the attack were the 9th New Jersey, which advanced through the farm fields of David Everett, and the 17th Massachusetts, which fought its way forward on top of the railroad embankment. 14 Union regiments in all advanced on some 2,000 Confederate defenders.
The attack falls heaviest on the 52nd North Carolina. They stay in their position actually pretty admirably for over an hour, but they're in danger of being cut off and really annihilated. All this firepower is being directed upon them because they're ones right in front of the railroad bridge, which is the objective. So after about an hour of staying in this position, these troops are compelled to retire. Some of them cross to the north bank of the river, but most of them climb down the embankment of the railroad and cross this open 200-yard wide field on the west of the railroad. Keep in mind there's a great deal of smoke on the battlefield at this point, and the 51st North Carolina in the tree line to the west of the railroad is not expecting anyone to be coming other than Union troops. They open fire when they see movement. It's a friendly fire incident. Fortunately for everyone involved, however, the men of the 51st this day were not very good shots. There are no reports of anyone from the 52nd actually having been killed or wounded by this friendly fire incident. These men then realize their mistake. They get together. They then recross this open field, climb up the embankment, and take position on the southeast of the railroad bridge, the position that the 52nd has just left. After about 30 to 45 minutes, they both are now in danger of being cut off, annihilated. Finally, they do evacuate this position, climbing back on the railroad embankment and going back across this 200-yard wide field where they take position in the tree line. About this time, the 17th Massachusetts comes along atop this really exposed position that they're in, this railroad embankment, which is again 12 or 15 feet above the level of the surrounding fields.
The 2 lead Federal regiments took cover in an area that had been excavated for the railroad embankment. There they continued to engage the Confederates, now on the north bank of the river. After a 2-hour battle, brave Union volunteers torched the railroad bridge under heavy fire. Federal artillery damaged the structure even more, and Union soldiers tore up a stretch of railroad tracks.
Foster realizes he's done all the damage he can do here. He has accomplished his mission. He did burn the railroad bridge that spans the Neuse River, and he wants to make it back to his campground that night and ultimately back to his base at New Bern. He knows that he needs to get on the road. So he has his men sling their knapsacks, shoulder their muskets, and leave the field. However, he does a smart thing. He leaves a rear guard. You always want to guard your rear when you're leaving a battlefield. He leaves ultimately, to begin with, an entire brigade, which is about 2,500 troops of infantry, along with a battery of artillery, Morrison's battery. But as the afternoon wears on and units keep leaving, want to get their place towards the campground as fast as they can, he's left with just the 5th Massachusetts and Morrison's battery of 6 guns. That's maybe 500 to 600 muskets and 6 guns. Still a formidable force. Up on the north bank of the river, the Confederates realize for the first time all day they're not being shelled any longer, and they surmise that I bet the Union troops are leaving the field. They've also been reinforced at this point by the 61st North Carolina and Mallett's North Carolina Battalion. So being reinforced as they were, Clingman decides he's going to cross back over the river, over the county wagon bridge, and attack the rear guard and try to destroy it to salvage something out of this situation.
The 51st and 52nd North Carolina moved forward to engage the Union rear guard, but were slowed by fences and ditches. Streaming down the embankment, they gave the rebel yell, which alerted the withdrawing Federals, who then reinforced their position. The Tar Heels were repulsed with heavy losses, and the Federals continued their withdrawal, which required the crossing of a frigid stream that the defenders had flooded by destroying a nearby dam. Overall, some 250 combatants became casualties at Goldsboro. Foster's raid was a tactical success for the Federal forces, as the railroad bridge had been destroyed. But that success was overshadowed by the Union disaster at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Confederates rebuilt the critical Goldsboro Bridge within weeks. As 1862 came to a close, Union forces held critical parts of coastal North Carolina, including Roanoke Island, Plymouth, New Bern, and Beaufort. Beaufort would be a refueling station for the Federal Navy's North Atlantic blockading squadron. New Bern became the military and political center for the Union in North Carolina. Wilmington remained in Southern hands, becoming the primary Confederate port on the Atlantic coast after Norfolk fell in May 1862. Federal forces also failed to seize and hold the railroad at Goldsboro, but the Union presence in New Bern required the diversion of Confederate troops to defend that critical supply line. The Union's strategic efforts would shift from North Carolina to other theaters of the war, including Virginia, South Carolina, and the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, Confederate leaders waited for an opportunity to retake New Bern and wrest away Federal control of North Carolina's coast. 1863 would prove to be a decisive year in the Civil War. President Lincoln would shift and add to the nation's direct mission, from simply restoring the Union to also ending slavery. The tide would begin to turn against the Confederacy, and the Southern secessionists sustained critical blows at the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg. That would be in July, which marked the 407th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of what had become the United States of America.